Okay, so here we go with my review for It, the novel by Stephen King, and this time I am doing the whole entire book as one review, and this is also going to be a little bit more laid back. Before I've done these reviews sort of more formally, this time I'm going to do it a little bit more laid back, try to make it a little shorter. And I'm just going to talk pretty much freely. So, starting out here, I read this book over a much longer period of time than I usually read books. This one was 8 months of reading, so I was able to get fully invested, and the reason I was able to do that was because I was taking time to read each chapter individually and do videos of those, and also I had some medical problems that prevented me from making videos for a little period there. So, the end result was 8 months of me getting to read this. Just a warning, this is going to be a full spoiler review. If you want my quick recommendation of the book, I would say check it out if you're used to Stephen King and you know the type of content that's usually in Stephen King books. If you're unfamiliar with Stephen King books and this is your first one, I would recommend looking up some warnings about the kind of content in this book. So jumping right in, the first thing I want to talk about is the setting of this book. This book sets up the setting better than just about any book I've ever read. I know I say that sometimes, but this is really true. The environments that are built, the tone of each environment, you can see them very clearly in your mind. You can almost picture them as though you were there, and some of the settings are almost themselves characters. A great example of this is 29 Neibolt Street. That house is very creepy, and you can just imagine what it would be like to be there if you've ever been around that kind of rundown house that you feel is haunted when you're a kid. Even the time itself is set up very well as far as the setting. 1958 Derry and 1957 Derry, you get a lot of feel for what it's like. And the 80s in Derry, it's interesting because they're taking place in the modern era, because this book was released in, I think, 1986. But they are sort of, those settings are painted in such a way that even though it's supposed to be taking place back in the 80s, you still feel like it's modern. And if you're a person who is a fan of 80s stuff, then that even more so will put you in that type of environment. So I just thought all of that was really good. And like I said in one of my videos, well, actually it was my video of the last chapter that I did the review of, this town, Derry, is a lot like the town I grew up in, and maybe it's just a little bit of nostalgia that is facilitating my sort of being immersed in the book that way, but I think more so it's just Stephen King's writing style. So the environments are not a problem. They're set up very well, and later in the book when we get down in the sewers, you can almost unfortunately smell those smells down in the sewers, and you can hear the sludge moving around and all that other kind of stuff. So it's just, I'm going to give this the same approval for the environments and the setting building I have for other Stephen King works, which is, it is very well done, basically 10 out of 10. Next, I'm going to talk about the characters and the character development and character building, and basically I think this is the best part of the book. Each character, you really get a sense of who they are, and having their characters be placed both in 1958 as kids and in 1985 as adults really helps with that, because you get a sense of their character arc all through their lifetime. And I'm going to just talk briefly about each and every single one of the main characters. So first we got, of course, Bill Denbrough, who's considered the leader. You can see how he has that guilt about what happens to his brother as a child. You can see about him trying to get back to that place of having a good relationship with his parents as a child, and some of the feelings that he has, and some of not nostalgia, but some of the feelings of sorrow he has for missing Georgie, they sort of go into his adult life when he's a writer, and it's very consistent with that, so that's very good. Bev Rogan, she unfortunately has to face some major adversity in her life that carried into her adult life, and you get to see how she overcame some of that, so that's really good for character development. Stan Uris, you can see his paranoia as a child, you can see how he has a willingness to be with the group and how he have a willingness to overcome things, but how his emotions get the better of him, and unfortunately how that ended for him. Mike Hanlon, he had a good relationship with his father as a child. He always sort of took after his father's curiosity about how he was investigating the town, and of course when he grew up he became sort of a historian and a librarian, so that was interesting to see. He also sort of became the secondary leader to the group as well when Bill Denbrough couldn't remember what was going on. Richie Tozier by far is my favorite character. His funniness as a child was very apparent, even though he wasn't always great at his voices, but he still was there to lift everyone up and lift everyone's spirits. And as an adult, of course, he became a radio host where he did all his voices, And even in moments of tension, he's trying to be the comic relief. He's really trying to build people up, but it never means that he doesn't care. Eddie Kaspbrak, who unfortunately we lost in the end of the book, but as a child, he had this thing with his mother where she told him that he needed to always be worried about his health, and she taught him to be a hypochondriac, and that sort of carried into his adult life. But in the end, he used that he used that as a strength when it came to helping fight the monster. Ben Hanscom, yes, he was a very entrepreneurial type person as a child and was always trying to find the best way to utilize the situation to make things work to their advantage with regard to the physical things as far as building and architecture and that kind of thing. And obviously when he grew up, he became an architect. So yeah, all of those characters were built up extremely well, and you feel very close to these characters by the end, and you feel invested. Stephen King has specifically said moments are scarier when you're invested in the story and you care about the characters and you want to see what's going to happen that much more. Of course, we get some of the side characters like Belch Huggins, Victor Criss, Henry Bowers, and Patrick Hochstetter. I thought all of those were built up well enough for what they needed to do. And I also like how you didn't get specifically everything about the characters, but it was still written in such a way where you get enough information to really get a sense of what's going on in each of these characters' minds. That's really great. And of course, the place, and I did talk about the locations already, but the Barrens as a place of safety for the characters and what it means to each of them and what it means to each of them. Again, just building that character development very well. So again, I would say that was executed probably 10 out of 10. The next thing I'm going to talk about is the style, and this is something that was really good in the book as well. By style, I mean how the scenes were written, the stories, what it set up as far as atmosphere, and this does tie a little bit into environment, which I already talked about, but I'm talking specifically about the events in the book. And I gotta say that everything was described really well. I can't really think of any event in the book that I thought needed to be described any better. Some things that stuck out to me, for instance, were just some of the murders that took place. The scene with Bev in the bathroom with the sink, with the blood just spurting up from the sink, and then them all having to clean it up and then it happening again, and just the horror that they all feel from that. Anything that happened down in the sewer as far as how much they kept getting lost and they discovered some of the bodies and just the paranoia that gave them. The stories when it showed up in various forms that terrified them. I think the story where there was the lost kid and his brother crawls up from the Konduskig and he's sitting there not really believing it but also realizing he needs to get away. All of those things I thought were described extremely well, and I would think about these things later on. I would be walking somewhere in my neighborhood. I would be going somewhere where there were lots of trees, and I'd be thinking about some of the scenes that happened close to wooded areas, or I'd be walking somewhere where there was a drain, and I'd be thinking about that, or even just being anywhere with a drain inside of a building. You'd think about those scenes where voices would come up. This is something that Stephen King is just extremely good at. Well, I won't go into specifics because I don't want to spoil anything, but there's one other Stephen King book that I read that actually scared me when I was in the house alone and I was thinking about it. And this book is the second one that's done that. Just, you're sitting there and you think about something in the book and you start to be scared. And I did describe a little bit of that in this, in my chapter-by-chapter reviews. For example, when they went into the house on 29 Neibolt Street, and that I happened to be reading alone that night. And I know these things are a little bit more personalized about my subjective experience, but when you're reading a book, the experience is always subjective. And I think Stephen King knows that when he writes these kinds of things, and he thinks about the things that will stick with you after you've closed the book. And I think that's true of this one too. So again, when it comes to this, as far as describing the events, and another one that stands out to me too is the fire at the Black Spot. That was just a very paranoia-inducing type thing to read. So thinking about we're closing in on the drain now. Thinking about those things just really set me at unease, or sometimes the things made me laugh too. There were moments that were highs and moments that were lows. And, the funny moments were really funny, and the sad moments were sad, and this is what Stephen King does. So I would again give this probably 10 out of 10. The next thing I want to talk about is the story, and if you've been watching my chapter-by-chapter reviews, you know in my last video, which was the epilogue review, I did have a couple of major things and specific things that I had a problem with when it came to the story. But I do want to talk about here why I like this type of novel, why I like this type of story. I think this novel has a writing style that evokes what life is actually like. And what I mean by that is life is not just one thing. You have highs and lows, you have emotional moments, you have happy moments that are blissful, you have sad moments that are grating, you have moments of horror. And this story is labeled as a horror novel, which I do sort of have a problem with because it's not just one type of thing. And I think Stephen King has said this at one point too. It technically is a horror novel because it has a lot of horror elements, and that's kind of the main thing, is it's creepy. But this has just as many moments that are charming in some chapters, and in some chapters it has just as many moments that are sad. In other words, horror is a theme that runs through the whole book, but there are a lot of other themes too that complement that. To contrast the moments of being horrified by what's going on, you have these moments of unity between the characters. To contrast these moments of sadness and loss, you have these moments of hilarity and unity. And I don't think that should be forgotten when people are thinking about what type of book this is. So for that purpose and as a whole, I really like the story for what it does in that regard. I also like the way that the story, kind of in another vein, jumps from past to present and jumps between different narratives. The story that it starts out with Georgie's death, and at the very end with it being defeated, and how the characters kind of come full circle, the ones that survived. I think that was just a fantastic way to tell this story. So, again, just as a whole and getting all these elements together, I think personally it's difficult to do that. It's difficult to know how much to throw in and what to take out, and where to start something, and what elements to include in the world, and what ones to leave out. And for what it is, I think it's great in that regard. Except for a couple things, which I have already talked about. But there are questions in the story that we don't get answered, that I don't really think we need to get answered, and that's something I did talk about. What I mean by that is there are all kinds of these elements floating around the story, and sometimes you want to know something that's going to fill in a gap, sometimes you really don't, and sometimes you really don't need to. And I thought this story did a really good job of balancing that, especially with the characters. I do need to talk about, with regard to the characters though, a little caveat. I did say the characters have development that is very good, and I think that's true, but there was a little bit of writing in this story that I thought was out of place for the characters, that almost took away from it. Luckily that happened not near enough to the end where I think it ultimately killed the character development, but I do think that was a little thing that I had to kind of phase out in my own headcanon, because the character development I thought was so good despite that it's still very strong. So that's why I'm having this seeming contradiction by saying there's this problem with the characters, but also the character development's very good, because we did still get to see their arc, and I thought that arc was very good. I know some people think that I might be overly focusing on little things that I did not like, but the problem is when you have a story that's so intertwined like I've just described, and you have something in it that does not work, it really doesn't work. It really takes away from it. So you really got to be careful with how you build up that type of narrative, I think. So those things don't overly take away from it, but I do think they prevent this story from being one of my favorite Stephen King books, if not my favorite, right up there with The Shining, which is my favorite. If that was confusing, I just mean The Shining is my number one book. This one probably could have been up there with that one if it wouldn't have been for just a few things in the story that I did not think were necessary and did not like. So just to give my final thoughts on this book was really good. Setting, A+, scenes, style, A+, character development, A+, with caveats. Story, I would say B-. I didn't really mind some of the supernatural elements that were kind of crazy. I mean, this isn't the first time I've had this happen in a Stephen King book. There's also a couple of random digs at atheism that are always kind of weird coming out of these sorts of books. But overall, you know, for what it is and the world it's building, I didn't really overly mind that in this case. It's just there's a couple of things in the storytelling that I thought were just really bad decisions that I didn't think made it, that I didn't think contributed to it being a great story. So basically this book probably could have been at the top as far as Stephen King books if it just wouldn't have been for those things, but I had a hell of a good time reading this book, and I will be watching the movies, and I'll be happy to watch those now just because of what it's done for building the characters and building this world. So hey, if you haven't read this, I don't know why you're watching this far into the video, but hey, if you have read this and you like this book, I agree with you. And I had a really good time reading this, and I wouldn't take any of it back as far as my time reading this, because it was time well spent in my opinion. Alright, well, if you like this content, be sure to like this content because I'll be making more of it. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey if you've been here the whole time. I've had, like I said, a really good time reading this book. It's been quite an adventure, and I look forward to my next book that I'll be reading. I don't know what that's going to be yet, but whatever it is, I'm sure I'll be doing some videos on it and stuff like that. So until next time, have a very good day, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.